Welcome to the Truth Over Comfort show. Today's returning guest is Matthew Hoh, who's a good friend of the show. He's been on, I think, 6, 7 times now. I think this may be his 8th, actually. He's been on to talk about his personal experiences in Afghanistan, Iraq, and then just his general kind of perspective on those same things, Ukraine, Israel, and kind of bringing us up today where he's going to give us a bit of an outline on the kind of the history of the US, UK, but probably more the US obsession with the Iranian regime and why there's such kind of fierce contempt towards them, and that has kind of really spread, I'd say, to a lot of the general public as well. And obviously this isn't just a US issue, it's the UK, and you've got the sanctions, and there's a nice history where it goes from obviously the Shah of Iran, who wasn't a nice guy either, but he was our friend then. So it's good to have you again on today, Matt. How you doing?
Good. Thanks, Louis. Happy to be here.
So obviously the elephant in the room would be kind of, the recent events with the Iranian and Israel kind of tit for tat, but obviously was a lot more kind of extreme, and there was a lot of worry that this was going to develop into a potential hot war, that it was kind of the first time in at least recent history that Iran directly struck Israel, obviously due to Israel bombing their consulate and embassy, near their embassy in Damascus, which apparently wasn't really part of much of the conversation when people seem to bring up that retaliation. But obviously there is kind of a long history here, and also that Iran used to be a very good friend of not only the US and the UK, but also Israel. They obviously had a good relationship, which is obviously the obvious reason they kind of hate them now. But what was kind of that previous relationship we had, and how did it all come about, I guess, with the infamous events, I guess, of Mohammed Mosaddeq and 1953?
Oh, for most of the Cold War, 2/3 of the Cold War, Iran was the focal point of the American empire of the West in the Middle East. That Iran was you could argue Israel was the most favorite of the nations in the Middle East for the Americans and the British in the West, but certainly in terms of strategic importance, Iran was the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the key driver, the key component of Middle East policy for the West, for the U.S., for the American empire. And I think that type of betrayal, if you will, put those in quotes for people who are listening, word betrayal, it gets to the idea of the word you used, which was really important, America's obsession with Iran. And so much of our relationship with Iran these last 40 years, since the overthrow of the Shah and the revolution, so 79 into 80, all those years, it's more psychological driven than almost anything else. I mean, there certainly are the geopolitics of it, the economics of it, there are the events of it, right? The things that have occurred. But there is also this psychological obsession by the Americans of Iran that is startling. I just had this happen again just a couple of days ago, where I was talking with somebody. We're having a very rational conversation, a good conversation. And when it turned to the Middle East, his focus on Iran was far outweighed. It carried just an enormous amount of burden for him. This obsession with Iran, this focus on Iran, like Iran was everything to him, and the need to get rid of Iran, and the need that would fix everything. I mean, like this type of obsession where nothing else matters but Iran, and all agency for anyone outside of Iran is completely discredited, lost. It has no meaning. So naturally, for Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, Ansar Allah in Yemen, they have no agency of their own. Everything has to be an Iranian, and to the point where you see just I know we try not to make these analogies, make these kind of associations between individuals, and nations, because there's obviously a tremendous amount of differences, kind of like, when you hear the analogy to a household budget and a government's budget. It's just not the same. You shouldn't be making that comparison. But in this case, the analogy seems to be there of someone who has been jilted, someone who's been stood up, someone who has been so hurt by what they feel is a betrayal that they are obsessed with that other person. And I think we all had our lives, maybe we've been that person, but we've all our lives have seen people so obsessed with someone, whether it be a former romantic partner, a family member, a boss or a coworker, or whatever, and you get that feeling because it's such a visceral emotion, particularly when Americans talk about Iran, that you're hitting at something very psychological in a way that you don't hear Americans express that type of emotion. It's not coming out of some fundamental place deep inside of them, like you hear when you hear Americans discuss other countries. I mean, there certainly is a bit of that with Russia and China, but this has been going on for 40 years. This type of obsession. Again, great word for it, and it colors how the United States and the West approach Iran, and it sets limits on what is available to be done. So in terms of dialogue, rapprochement, any type of policies, and then that extends it into the sanctions and certainly the U.S. military footprint in the region, our support for Israel, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, and I do truly think it is an obsession, because when you hear certain American political figures, and again, it always going to drip feed down, and there's going to be people in the American public who really obviously don't like the country, but a lot of it obviously comes from political figures who are truly obsessed with it. I mean, obviously the neocons are infamous for it, and obviously Israel as well. And during the early 2000s, a lot of people, there was that quote, I think it was from a British military official, it's like, boys want to go to Iraq, real men want to go to Iran, because they're like, why are we wasting our time with Iraq here when Iran's the true one? And it's ever since obviously the Shah fell to the revolution in 1979, there's direct correlation between this obsession about the country, and even the political environment in America is more specific, I think, than the UK, which obviously has a lot to it as well. That obviously back in kind of the colonial days, Iran was obviously part of that system, and obviously leading up to Mosaddeq, which we can obviously get to again. But just I remember watching Rudy Giuliani, I think if he was running for president or some sort of campaign, and they're just chanting regime change to Iran, he gets this chant going but the people in the crowd are obviously chanting it back, and I'm like, I don't think you'd see that in the UK or other countries, just literally chanting, let's overthrow a foreign government and kill a bunch of people and do all this stuff, and that's just open, just normal politics, and that's what you're obsessed about rather than what's going on in your own country. It's just quite strange the way Americans behave towards the country. But again, part of this conversation that's always left out is, okay, so 1979, the revolution happens, we lose a great ally, and we should be annoyed at Iranians for that and punish them now. But when they bring up, well, the revolution of the person overthrown was someone you put in because the UK, MI6, the CIA, overthrew Mohammed Mosaddeq in 1953, partly because he wanted to obviously nationalize the British Iranian oil company. And then they also kind of played into the Americans, he's a nationalist and could be communist. We overthrow him. It's pretty much from the British side, obviously all about oil and direct correlation. That's a pretty open secret that he nationalized. And this happened, and we installed the Shah of Iran, and you can read all about this. It's pretty public now. And Kermit Roosevelt's cousin, he was the CIA chief, and he wrote a book about it, and says about how Winston Churchill said, it would have been great to be part of this operation with you. that is completely left out of the story, and Iranians can't be annoyed that we, the British, obviously meddled for a long time there, other Western nations, the Middle East. America picks up that, carries on, and then their guy gets overthrown, and we men are feel bad towards the British Americans because it's just kind of bizarre when you kind of lay it out like that.
Well, one of the things that's interesting about this idea of obsession, and obsession then coloring policy, making people blind and do foolish and stupid things. At that point in the early 50s, the Americans were so crazed with the fear of communism and so crazed about the diabolical nature of the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union's tentacles were were everywhere. And you see this if people go to the National Security Archives at George Washington University a number of years ago, when they received these documents. They got a big dump of documents on this 53 coup in Iran. And what their archivists found was that in terms of the British role, was just as you said. They wanted the oil. That's simple, right? Very, very commercial, very transactional. They want the oil. But on the American side, it was much more about this fear of the Soviet Union, that because Mossadeq's a socialist, that means he must take his marching orders from Moscow. I mean, completely preposterous, blows away any historical understanding about the relationship between Russia and Iran that had existed for centuries. Very adversarial relationship. In fact, a friend of mine who worked for General William Odom, who was one of the good American generals. I don't mean in a moral sense, but capable, competent, smart American generals of the second half of the 20th century and early 21st century. General Odom would be just absolutely spinning in his grave if he knew that the United States, through its policies, had pushed Moscow and Tehran together. I mean, this is a magical achievement. How we did this, this is a cosmic achievement for the United States to have brought about this ahistorical union between Moscow and Tehran. But the Americans in the early 50s were so convinced that the Soviet Union was behind every door, that they were lying in wait in every bush and under every carpet, that anything that had the faintest, slimmest glimmer of connection to socialism or communism meant that it had to be controlled by Moscow. And so they saw in this socialist prime minister, Mosaddeq, in Iran, and then through his actions, particularly of nationalizing the oil company, that danger. And so they were obsessed with the Soviet Union's control of the world, essentially, and then with the British desire to keep the oil that they had, because Mossaddeq had nationalized the oil that the British felt belonged to them. At that point, it was called the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, APOC. It then became British Petroleum after that. But, so they felt that they had their oil stolen from them, and the hypocrisy in that, of course, you're taking someone else's oil and, But yeah, I mean, so that obsession, though, was one obsession with the Soviet Union that then puts in motion the events, the police state of the Shah. So when Mosaddeq is overthrown, is taken out, the Shah is already there. He's already the Shah, but he is now elevated into really he was a monarch, but a dictator role, and he enforces a police state. And he's also the most reliable ally the United States has in the Middle East, including Israel, because if people remember, Israel has done things throughout time that has been very inimical and very antagonistic to American interests, such as seizing the Suez Canal, such as attacking the U.S.'s liberty, things like that. Through all the time period, the Shah was reliable. He was dependable. He was happy to take the money from his oil revenue, right, share that with international oil companies as well. But the money that he was gathering from it, he was happy to turn around and then spend that on American weapons. He also was a fierce capitalist. He believed in the American way. He was anti-communist. So again, this obsession with the Soviet Union, this obsession with communism, not just in Iran's case, but across the world, has the United States abandoning any aspects of dedication to human rights, democracy, freedom, et cetera, all the things that we supposedly stood for, completely belied by actually our actions throughout the Cold War, where we backed, not just the Shah, but dozens upon dozens of murderous dictators around the world, as well as committed dozens and dozens of coups throughout that time. I think we were committing a coup on average more than once a year throughout the Cold War when you add it all up. So, I mean, what this obsession that comes out of 79 and 80, and then, of course, the spectacle of the hostage crisis, which comes many months after the Shah's overthrown. And the thing about the Americans is that we don't appreciate how, I think, widespread the revolution was. So the revolution that upends the Shah's government, takes him out of power, is incredibly broad. It encompasses all parts of Iranian society. I mean, the Shah's rule was so unpopular, that police state was so unpopular. His economic policies had really begun to unravel. So there was, I'm sorry, I remember what it was called, but there was a period where they would point to great success in Iran, that the Shah's modernization efforts. And the Shah and his government were spending untold amounts of money to modernize the country. And there, of course, was an enormous amount of corruption. A lot of that modernization went into military hardware, not into things for the people. And also, too, there was it deepened a split in the country between the urban and the rural. The traditional and the secular, right? The modern and the modern and the conservative, excuse me. The religion and the secular, the modern and the traditional, I should say. And so, I mean, by the time the end of the 70s come, Iranians across the political spectrum, across classes, are united in their hatred for the Shah. So when the revolution comes, it is a broad-based revolution. Now, the Islamic Revolution, led by Ayatollah Khomeini, they are the ones who actually take power because they're better organized, they're better financed, they have a plan, maybe they're more ruthless, but certainly, they take control because of their competency and their capability, as well as being able to appeal to a large mass of Iranians who felt aggrieved, who felt left behind, and felt punished by the Shah for the 2.5 decades he was in power. But what happens for the Americans, too, is that the Americans, when they have an opportunity to embrace this revolution and to, agree with they don't. And they further the hole they're in with the Iranian people, not just by having supported and kept in power the Shah for those 25 years or so, but staying loyal to him. So when the Shah is deposed and he is sick, the Americans are open to him. They allow him to come to the U.S. for hospital treatment. They won't return him to Iran to face trial for his crimes. So another aspect of where the Americans, by betraying their own self-announced principles, particularly in the case of the Shah personifying it that way, it's one more step for the Iranian people to be aggrieved at the Americans. And then, of course, though, the Americans, getting back to this point, is the Americans are obsessed with Iran, this betrayal by Iran, as they feel. It's totally childish. It makes no sense. But it's this attitude of betrayal. And then, of course, where it becomes very emotional, very visceral, is in the hostage crisis. And when the American embassy staff are taken hostage, I was born in 1973. So the hostage crisis for me, being 6, 7 years old, that was kind of the first thing I remember of the world, of world events, of being cognizant of what was happening. It was the hostage crisis. And as a 6 or 7 year old, it was a big deal here in the United States. It was on the news every day. The American television program Nightline, which is kind of which in terms of news media was groundbreaking in many ways. And, it was a program on ABC that is a half hour long, focusing on one subject that occurred after your evening news. So about 11:30 p.m. here in the United States, it would come on. And it was unlike anything else that had been done before in a number of ways. But that starts dedicated to the hostage crisis. So in the hostage crisis, you have Ted Koppel on ABC every night talking about it. That's how tightly connected Americans were to the hostage crisis, and that, of course, feeds in to this obsession. And so, as you were talking about before, Louis, when politicians, people in the media speak about Iran, it hits a chord within Americans, in a way that resonates, and then that just reinforces this ability to have these sanctions, these policies, these proxy wars that are just absolutely absurd, unless you're looking at it in a sense of an aggrieved, betrayed, obsessed, vindictive personality.
Yeah, just on that, obviously, because a lot of it is mainly about the fact that they lost their greatest ally in the Middle East, and it is a country full of resources and powerful country, and massive actual physical size as well. As we all know, if the current Iranian regime, as it was, if you want to think it's the most theocratic, against human rights, won't let women wear, what they want and all that sort of stuff. If they played ball with America, they would be our greatest ally still. It's just like Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is the perfect example of, yet you can label all this stuff on Iran if you want to, sure. And you can label the same on Saudi Arabia, and they're the new Iran, and that's it. That's all you have. That's all you need to know. Like it even if because the hostage crisis, people, like you said, it's going to strike a nerve because there is maybe legitimate, obviously, emotion attached to that. Obviously, because it is broadcast a lot, it becomes a national tragedy, and obviously Americans kind of latch onto that a lot of the time, and that is kind of legitimate example. Obviously, there's a lot of stuff around it, and the geopolitics and everything that led up to there doesn't, can't take that away. But people will have legitimate grievances there. But at the end of the day, if they played ball, it just wouldn't even be a factor. They'd be Saudi Arabia, and most people probably don't really like Saudi Arabia, but they don't hate it. Like. No one talks about Saudi Arabia the way they talk about Russia, China, and Iran. There's like a real hatred in their voice when they're talking or ranting about it. People are like, yeah, Saudi Arabia, they're, medieval times, but meh, that's it. They don't talk about it in the same way, which is interesting. It just shows, obviously, the hypocrisy of the US within that relationship.
Right. And you have this idea that Iran is the greatest state sponsor of terrorism in the world, and what we know is that it's actually Saudi Arabia, and we know that because of WikiLeaks. WikiLeaks released files from the U.S. State Department where Hillary Clinton herself acknowledges that the Saudis are the biggest sponsor of terrorism in the world, particularly their support for Al Qaeda and other reactionary Sunni jihadist groups. This obsession with Iran. Into your point there about how it doesn't matter what any other countries are doing, and of course there's the hypocrisy of it. It's just this frenzied latching on, and you wonder what would happen to American policy if Iran disappeared, if you waved a magic wand and that part of the map just wasn't there anymore, or if there was some type of counter-revolution, great reform, how would the American establishment, how would the American foreign policy machine deal with that? Because so much of its policies have been dedicated to being counter, things where we have waged actual and proxy war in other countries. When you speak to the American policymakers, they come back to Iran. I want to go back to one thing that's interesting about this obsession, because it's not uniquely American. If you go and you look at the debates in the Kremlin in 1979, as with the 78, 79, with the events in Afghanistan, and then you got to put that in the context of the events throughout the rest of the Muslim world at that point. What occurs in Pakistan, what occurs in Saudi Arabia in 78, where there are very serious, very concerning attempts on the government by Islamic revolutionaries, to put it simply. I mean, so this is what happens in Iran is not a localized phenomenon. This is the way the U.S. and the Soviet Union, both parts of the Cold War, are viewing this this Islamic revolutionary movement with great concern. And one of the things that happens is that the Russians or the Soviets are as obsessed with the Americans as the Americans are obsessed with the Soviets, to the point that they can't think straight. They see everything colored with the red, white, and blue, with the stars and stripes, just as we saw everything with the red and gold, the hammer and sickle. And so what happens when the Americans lose their bases in Iran, the Soviets say, well, this is always about us. The Americans are always focused on us. They're going to have to move their bases somewhere else. And what's occurring with the turmoil, the conflict in Afghanistan, part of the Soviet discussion at the Politburo level is this idea that if we don't stabilize Afghanistan, it's possible that the Americans can move into Afghanistan. They lost their bases in Iran. They got to go someplace else. I mean, and this is just a ludicrous proposition. There's no evidence whatsoever that when the Americans lost Iran, so to speak, nobody said, let's go to Afghanistan. Just wasn't even a thought. But in the Politburo, the Soviet Union, the Kremlin, that's the discussion they're having. So you can see how this type of obsession, while we're focusing on the Americans, of course, it is a human phenomenon, right? It's part of human nature, whether it's an individual or as part of a group. And potentially as a group, I guess it's even scarier because you get into the concepts of groupthink, right? But the focus on Iran by the Americans, you see that, of course, with some of the arguments for the invasion of Iraq, that somehow removing Saddam Hussein, who is the best hedge to Iran in the Middle East, and in that cold sense, somehow the Americans think that by removing Saddam Hussein, putting in someone who is more pliant with them, who's more in agreement with them, who's more willing to follow the Americans, that this will be a stronger hedge to the Iranians. And of course, that is spectacularly disastrous. If people ask who won the Iraq War, a lot of commentators will say Iran did. And then the same thing, too. We go over one nation westward. Just another example is in the Syrian war, a decade ago. And the obsession by the Americans on Iran is clear, that American involvement in Syria, while there is a degree of desire to get rid of Assad and some other things, do whatever they can to make the region more amenable, more in favor with Israel's interests, say, so get rid of Assad, that would take away some of the support for, say, Hezbollah. But they always come back to Iran. Even those who argue it that way, they come back to Iran. And their argument is that Iran, I mean, if you get rid of Assad, you weaken Iran. They make this argument, you get rid of the transportation corridor that connects Iran to Hezbollah and Lebanon. Of course, that corridor didn't exist until you got rid of Saddam Hussein, but don't take that into account when you're making your policies about past mistakes you've made, or not past mistakes, but incredibly stupid errors. And then, but the thing is that you see this very clearly, and it's I think it's in 2017, Michael Vickers, who was the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations and Low Intensity Conflict, and he became as well the head of intelligence for the Pentagon, essentially. He writes an op-ed in, I think it was 2017, in the Washington Post, basically saying this out loud, basically saying the entire Syrian war, our involvement in the Syrian war, was to hurt Iran. That this was our best chance to hurt Iran. And he was arguing that the Trump administration should continue the Obama policy of involvement in Syria, trying to get rid of Assad. And the arguments are all about Iran, right? They're not about, anything you might think they might want to say to make it seem as if we are supporting some type of struggle of the people to overthrow a dictator. No, because that has nothing to do with it. And again, but this obsess. So we will we will help, we will prolong the deaths of 500,000 people in Syria, see however many millions become refugees, see it become a wasteland, a destroyed country where people are still suffering to this day, because this is about Iran. And even now, when you see the arguments for the United States occupying roughly a third of Syria, contrary to international law and everything, the arguments come back to Iran. Right? It always comes back, oh, we got to be there to stop the Iranians from sending Katyusha rockets to Hezbollah. Right? I mean, so it is this everything the United States, not everything, but the United States, the way it structures its policy and the way it carries out its policy is so predicated upon this Iran mania that, you know, any policy you come up with is going to be destined to fail because you're not looking at the problem with clear eyes. You're imagining the problem, or maybe you're getting 34% of the problem correct and ignoring all these other massive parts and tranches of the problem. And so for anything, you know, when you're trying to solve anything and you're in the dark like that, let alone being led by these intense, hallucinations, fantasies, whatever about this one sinister country that's behind everything, well, of course you're going to have a failed foreign policy record like the United States.
Yeah, because I'm glad you brought out that, because it is kind of an overlooked point of. Sorry, I've got a bit of a sore throat. The obsession with Iran isn't just vocal or sanctions; it's genuine war. Iraq was an example, and the thing is, it is an obsession about Iran, but I know you obviously mentioned Israel, but it's still really tied in because obviously Israel has an obsession about Iran as well. So it's all kind of comes back. Like you said, like it was like where the neocons wrote the paper. What was it? What was it called?
The Project for New America Century.
Yeah, where David Wormser and the others wrote a paper for Netanyahu in 1996, and it's about how, you know, if we install like a friendly king or someone to do with the Jordanian king in Iraq, we can strengthen Turkey and Jordan and Israel, and it will go against Iran. And then obviously part of that policy they actually did obviously try and overthrow Saddam Hussein, as you said, who was a bulwark against Iran, who fought a war against Iran in the 80s, who, again, their obsession was so with Iran that they somehow missed the picture of, you know, why don't we just work with Saddam Hussein? You know, if we're willing to do this horrible stuff, let's work with Saddam Hussein. Let's be friendly with him, and we can use him against Iran. And they just missed that and went after him anyway. And then, as you said, Iran won out of that war, is more friendly with it now, has more influence there. And the angle from Israel and the US was, if we get rid of him, we will weaken Iran, which is good for Israel and the US. And then same with Syria. They're like, as you said, yeah, we can stop the shipment of weapons coming from Iran across, they call it the land bridge.
Right, which drives me nuts. Like, that's what a road is.
If it's a bridge over not water, then it's just whatever. So yeah, to stop the weapons going through Syria to get to Hezbollah again for Israel. And again, it wasn't just about Israel, because you had Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Britain, France, everyone involved. There was so that was, you know, quite. I mean, other than obviously the bloodshed, if you look at it from, you know, a historical kind of view, it was quite interesting to see obviously all the different hands in there, and obviously Russia included and Iran as well. But again, that obsession with Iran was, again, it's pretty open. Like there was an ex Clinton official, and he wrote a whole thing in 2012 in Foreign Policy about the whole thing. It was like, let's, you know, do this proxy war for Israel, basically, to weaken Iran. They don't really, you know, hide it. The commentators as well, maybe, you know, the military officials have to go on TV, but these people outright say this is good for Israel and hurts Iran. And you're like, even now, like with Iran's reaction, it's like, as long as Israel doesn't bomb Iran, it's fine. Just bomb some Iranian assets in Syria. Like, Syria is just this country. We're like, yeah, don't worry about Syria. Yeah, you can bomb Syria. That doesn't matter. They don't have sovereignty. You know, Israel bombs, obviously, Syria every kind of month, basically bombs their airports and obviously things there. And that's fine. And again, this all kind of to do with Iran, which sounds kind of crazy, but just kind of listen to their own words, their own articles. And they were so willing to overthrow the Syrian government that we was, whether you want to say directly supported or indirectly, we strengthened Al Qaeda and ISIS. We were so obsessed with overthrowing them that we was willing to work with the people who attacked us on 9/11, who again weren't Iranian, weren't Syrian. There was 15 Saudi Arabians. It just always comes back. It's again, what you said earlier with Iran being called the #1 state sponsor of terror, and you can say, okay, they have their proxies around here, but so does Saudi Arabia. That's normally directly Al Qaeda, ISIS, and it's not just Saudi Arabia. If you read the WikiLeaks emails with Clinton, which is multiple times, they're like Kuwait, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, all massive sponsors of terrorist groups, either through people, just rich people in the country, or the government. And they talk about the issue of this, that we need to bring it up. You have speeches by can't remember the name. It was in 2014, and it's kind of to do with terrorism and money. And he's again openly saying, Saudi Arabia and these countries need to do better. Money's going to groups in Syria and here, and there's just so much information out there about their funding of terror. There was a court case in London with Qatar and funding al-Nusra, and there's just so many examples. But that's out the window. No one's like, oh, let's go invade Saudi Arabia or Qatar. And even with the scale of Israel now, where people like Hamas is supported by Iran, Hamas is supported by them. Well, they're actually also financially supported by the Gulf nations. But again, you don't have this hatred to go invade them because of it, because it's just, obviously in the public and the media constantly talk about it. But just going back, just skipping back a bit, when you mentioned obviously the Shah in Iran and the police state, again, I'm not sure how knowledgeable you are. How kind of brutal was his regime? Because again, we go to the Iranian mullahs now and this horrible regime, and obviously people may say the Iranian regime is more moderate, kind of like, I guess, like the UAE trying to be now. But what was his regime actually like? When you call it a police state, why do you say that?
Oh, it was in a sense of having an authoritarian rule that was enforced through a secret police mechanism to the where people were taken away in the middle of the night. People weren't sure who ratted on them, right? There was that level of surveillance, spying, and then the unease that occurred and the lack of mistrust that spread throughout the society because, you didn't know when the Shah's men were going to come and take someone away. And so I think you look at the numbers, and thousands were imprisoned by the Shah. I don't off the top of my head, I don't remember the numbers that were executed, but it was large enough to have a degree of fear spread throughout the society. But what you also had too was there was no real opposition to the Shah. You couldn't express your political opposition. You couldn't suppress, as well as religious convictions were suppressed. I mean, it wasn't outlawed, but it also, too, was something that the Shah and his people saw as a threat. So it was limited in a way. So I think if you look at, there was a film I saw a bunch of years ago. I was thinking about it the other day. I wish I could remember the name of it. But it was basically a fictionalized version of this. I wish I could remember who was in the lead. It was a good film, but it was essentially, a role like where you have someone like the Shah in power and his police state and all the trappings of the military uniforms and everything like that. And, and then a person who is involved very close helps the revolution overthrow him. And then what you get in exchange is a theocratic state that is just as brutal, just as oppressive as what you overthrew. So it's just the other side of the coin. Kind of very similar to what you're talking about with like that duality between Saudi Arabia and Iran. It's really as if you draw a line down the Persian Gulf and folding a piece of paper kind of thing. The two halves there certainly meet and match up. And so I think that's what you have in a lot of cases, because under the mullahs, you have had a very repressive government, a very repressive regime. There is a degree of democracy in Iran that is much greater than elsewhere in the region, certainly much greater than, say, Saudi Arabia or Kuwait or any of the Gulf monarchies. They do have elected leadership extending from the local level to the national level, but it's all at the pleasure of the supreme leader. So it's all at the pleasure of the religious authorities. So you will have times where you have reformers elected to president, right? You will have men who come into power who are willing to talk with the West, work with the West. But at the same time, too, everything is done, though, with the approval of the religious authorities. So while there is that degree of democracy in Iran, it's only democratic so far. And there are also, as we've seen, just in the last year and a half, the repression, the authoritarianism, the theocracy comes into reality when you have this enforcement on headscarves for women, right? And you have crackdowns, and you certainly have a willingness of the government in Iran to use brutal measures to call out their thugs, right? To call out their people, their paramilitary forces, their brown shirts, if you will, to enforce the government's rule. And so you've seen in these crackdowns, as well as the use of the death penalty, extreme measures that we should, of course, balk at, very similar to the Saudis. And I think many people would say, hey, how dissimilar is it from the U.S., as the U.S. cracks down on, protesters on college campuses. Certainly the Shah's regime was brutal. It was murderous. It created a climate of fear. And it also created very much a country, I think, of have and have-nots. And that's, I think, what I find most is when people write about this, talk about this, is they talk about those who are left out. Those who are left out. And if you're left out and you try to get in by raising your voice, that's when the police state came into being. And so you had a very unequal society. And that, and I think maybe that is in the case with the theocracy we see with the mullahs that have ruled for 40 years now in Iran, more than 40 years. You see more of a concern for meeting the needs of the people. You also have, though, what I think keeps the regime in power is this fortress or the siege mentality. So for 44 years, Iran has been besieged by the West, whether through sanctions, through proxy warfare, through direct action. I mean, they've had their scientists assassinated. They've had cyber attacks launched on them. They've had drone attacks. A year ago, Israel attacked one of their facilities, their munitions facilities with drones. I mean, they've had, 5 or 6 of their scientists murdered, assassinated, right? At least 2, maybe more cyber attacks that I can think of. As well as, say, the war in the 80s, where Iraq was given a green light by the Americans. I mean, that's clear, to attack Iran, and then supported throughout those 8 years, and more than 1 million people died. It was brutal. And then all the sanctions, all the harassment, if you will, the constant threats. The largest naval engagement since World War II occurs between the Americans and the Iranians in 1987, I believe it is, 86 or 87. It's the Battle of the Oil Rigs or something like that it's called. But it's the largest naval battle since the end of World War II. Occurs between the Iranian Navy and the American Navy at the end of the 80s, in the second half of the 80s. So, I mean, there's all these reasons why they have this siege mentality. And through this, that unites the Iranian people. So I think even though there are certainly millions of Iranians who are extremely dissatisfied with their rulers, they also are united, though, by this threat from the outside, right? And how long would this regime have lasted if it was left open to the world? is a good question. I mean, but certainly 44 years of sanctions, blockade, direct and indirect war with Iran has, led to the regime seeming to be pretty much, stable and with a brighter future, I think, than what you could argue for other countries around in the region.
Yeah, I think it was called the Battle of the Tankers, the oil tankers. Yeah, again, the weird thing, again, going back to that word obsession, is that it's been completely counter active to obviously what the US actually wants. This obsession with going into places like Iraq. Again, there's so many different reasons, but again, the factor normally can be part of it would be obviously weakening Iran. Going into Iraq, going into Syria is not made the US position any better. It's made Iran's better. It's only closer with not only Russia, but also China. Pushed all the, and again, it's the same with all countries, it's pushed them together into this new bloc, which is basically, other than Europe, the North America, Australia, and then your country is, that's it now. You see at the UN every time people vote, including the Gulf nations, which obviously hedging their bets a bit, and they can play off the US and obviously Russia and China because they have so much oil wealth themselves. But they've created this new bloc, and they've dragged their name through the mud in the Middle East and around the world, and just their whole obsession to weaken Iran has made it stronger. Like, they basically, been almost, someone hired them to strengthen Iran. They've done that job. So, and there's never a moment of self-reflection. There's always double down, triple down, and carry on today. And again, it's the same with Russia. And they sanction these countries, arm a bunch of people against them, poster, and then say, yeah, why don't you rise up and overthrow them? You're like, then again, the population is going to double down and go, why would we want to be friends with you after you did all these things to us? And the government was the one who carried on, giving us food and keeping us alive for it. So it's just a bizarre strategy. I wasn't, before, like when I was first getting into this, I always thought like they must know what they're doing, but now it just seems like they are clouded by certain judgments, and there's too many financial interests in the way, like Israel, Saudi Arabia, where wars like Syria, even with the Iranian obsession, may have not been as strong, may not have happened. Again, it's not always one country. There's just so many financial interests in different groups, which means the US can't really make a decision. I was kind of speaking to this with Kelly Vlahos, where if you was actually trying to run an empire as successfully as possible, they just wouldn't be doing the things they're doing. There's too many financial interests in the way to actually successfully run an empire. And I'm sure it had similarities to empires before, but they seemed not maybe as burdened by all these different interests, like the arms industry, where like the war in Ukraine has been a disaster. Russia's stronger again, but it's bringing a lot of money from the arms companies. And you're like, if they looked at it honestly, it wasn't kind of that massive rolling door, that they may have made different decisions. But just since obviously the Israel war is obviously still going on, what do you think kind of Israel's role has been in this kind of relationship between the US and Iran, and how much do you think Israel actually affects it in kind of this century?
Yeah, and I took it was Operation Praying Mantis in 1988, this big sea battle between the Iranians and the Americans. So it was 88. Your point there about the financial interests is really important to bring up, in that too many people essentially are making money with the status quo to change it, and that you need to have that break. You need to have that type of departure from the status quo to allow for change. And so what do you have then is you have policies that continue that are failing policies, but there are people who are still making money for it. But the future of it is very bleak and potentially dangerous. And so you can't get off of the path you're on, right? Everyone wants to make money into the very last moment. And, you look at, say, the Ukraine war, which, disastrous for the U.S., particularly, I mean, it's a disaster, especially for the Ukrainians. I wouldn't say it's been that great for the Russians either. But the thing about where you could start, if you want to start talking about who has won or who's got a success, one of the things you have to say about the Ukraine war is the United States has been successful, as the United States now controls the LNG market in Europe. Right. So before the Ukraine war, the United States was not the leading exporter of LNG in the world. We were approaching it, but we needed those European markets to take it. And with the Ukraine war, we were able to, remove Russia from that market and take it for ourselves. So when you start looking at all these various interests, and that's the thing I think we run into the danger, right, of like oversimplifying it. And I know we want to try and simplify it because how else do we have a conversation? We're not, otherwise we're basically trying to communicate a 1,000-page book to people. But there are a confluence of interests that find unity, right, in a certain purpose. And one of those things is, I think, with Israel, having that those overlapping interests, and with, say, the obsession with Iran, and then Israel's place in the region, of course, but then its role in American politics. You can see that that union. You could see how the two issues can be very tightly interwoven so that they become inseparable. So to be anything for Israel is to be something against Iran, and to be anything against Iran is to be something for Israel. And so this psychological obsession with Iran, it plays very well with Israeli interests. And certainly Israel has its reasons for its antagonism with Iran. I think many will point to the fact that Iran is chief ally of Hezbollah. But most people who point that out also conveniently ignore the fact that Hezbollah did not exist until Israel invaded Lebanon. Right. I mean, so they've taken out what are not just the root causes why these organizations exist in the first place, but what is their grievance? Why do they still exist? Why does Iran have an ally in Lebanon that is armed and capable and organized like Hezbollah? Well, it's because the Israelis have invaded Lebanon twice in the last 40 years, and they're threatening to do it again. We don't go very long. Every week or two, we see another report coming out of Israel about how they're planning for it. This general was just in the north of Israel, and he's telling the troops, "Get ready, guys. We're going soon." So what's good for Israel is bad for Iran, and vice versa. And so you have that nexus, right? You have that intertwining that it serves a variety of interests very, very well. It's important, to try and, of course, we have to make things digestible and understandable, not just for people we're talking to, but for ourselves. But you have to also always come back to that. They are, say you brought up the Project for a New American Century a while back, which is this American neoconservative think tank, essentially, in the 90s that wanted to establish American dominance, wanted to ensure we had just, quote, won, unquote, the Cold War. And how do we ensure that primacy? How do we ensure America's a lasting empire, that we are the sole superpower? So this Project for New American Century essentially says it in the title. How do we have a new American century? The great thing was the 20th century was famously the American century, as Henry Lucius said. But what's the next century going to be? And at that point, people are not predicting the 21st century to be American. All right, so how are we going to go about ensuring that it is another American century, a new American century? And, so when you look at these various people who are in that group, in that PNAC, they come to it with a variety of different reasons, for a variety of different backgrounds and impulses and what drives them. But what they can find is common cause, and particularly in something that then they can latch onto, like this obsession with Iran, which, again, you go back to the way it was so, one of the things with the Chinese you have is, how do you get Americans to hate the Chinese? You know, the Republicans in the U.S. are doing a really, really aggressive push to get Americans to hate the Chinese because of fentanyl, right? And there's also then they're tying it to the immigration crisis. So somehow the Chinese are responsible for immigrants taking jobs in Toledo, Ohio. I don't know how it works out, but like that's the, you know, and by the way, and on the way, they're murdering Americans with fentanyl. You know, I mean, so they're desperately trying to get some type of emotional attachment, hatred to the Chinese, in the way that we have this in the United States is hatred toward the Iranians because of what they did to our hostages, right? You know, and so with the Russians, it's the same thing. It's just as hard. You can get people who are scared of them for a while. You can bring up all the Red Scare things, but you know it falls flat a lot of times. You know, but with the Iranians, because you had those blindfolded American hostages bound and on television, well, they really hurt us. You know, and so I think, you know, regardless of whether you're coming to this desire for American hegemony, this desire for a new American century because of financial interests, because of ideological interests, because you're a militarist, you know, because you're a megalomaniac, whatever, you know, you think it's just good politics. You know, what you find in Iran is a really great boogeyman. Right. And so that's why you see Iran pop up all the time in terms of, you know, when you need to scare somebody, you bring up the Iranians.
And obviously the Muslim terrorist angle as well there. But I mean, we'll wrap it up because I know you got to jump up. But with China, I mean, they just keep chucking stuff on the wall. Like, you know, you got Uyghurs genocide or Taiwan or fentanyl or TikTok, or just keep naming stuff until you get one. The Uyghurs was around for a while, trending. That's kind of gone off the map.
Right.
Everyone's kind of forgotten about that. And that one's just absurd that the US, the people who killed all those Muslims in the Middle East, care about this small sect of Muslims in China. Like, it's bizarre.
Right.
Obviously, Taiwan, that does kind of grab people in, to be fair. That one, they don't even know the official US policy is that Taiwan's part of China.
Right, exactly.
Apparently not, because you wouldn't think so. You wouldn't think so. I wouldn't have thought so until I looked it up, you know, because it's just spoken about like it's not. And with the China one, I think they can scare. They are getting to people's heads about that because I don't know. They're just always like, you know, Russia and China, like these cyber attacks, and they just keep the balloon that they eventually admitted was just a weather balloon, but two people don't remember the reprint of the story. But I think they are good at getting people to hate a country if they wanted to. I mean, it's just bizarre. Like, I don't really know how people can't be see through it as much. That have you ever wondered why the governments you feel the most hate towards, you know, when someone says the Chinese, you know, there's like anger in their voice, like the Chinese and the Russians and Iranians, you hate them the most. That's interesting. Why those three and why not other countries? And they all just happen to be countries that they want you to hate and forming this block. It's just people just don't.
What you had too recently, or in the last few years, is you have those who are arguing to settle our differences with the Taliban, an rapprochement with the Afghan Taliban, because you can utilize the Taliban against the Iranians, right? So you just come out of this 20-year-long war with the Taliban, and you now you suffer a humiliating defeat, you know, just $2 trillion wasted, 2,500 dead Americans, God knows how many dead Afghans, et cetera, et cetera. And now you're just going to say, don't worry about it. We're going to work with the Taliban to go after the Iranians, because if push comes to shove, we can have the Iranians open. You know, it's the same thing too. Why are the Americans so muted about what Azerbaijan did with regards to the Nagorno-Karabakh and the ethnic cleansing that took there? Clear ethnic cleansing. I mean, and you know, Azerbaijan is run by a horrible dictator and incredibly corrupt country, repressive, all those things. Well, there is these thoughts in people's head that the Azerbaijanis would be used against the Iranians, that we've got to stay in good favor with the Azerbaijanis because they potentially could be proxies, allies, whatsoever, whoever, in a war with Iran. I mean, this is the type of mania, this hysterical obsession with Iran that causes people just to become fantasists and fabulous, as well as to just, conveniently upend 20 years of war. Forget about it. It meant nothing. We're now going to, I mean, it's crazy, you try not to use words like crazy, I guess. But right, you try and find something more descriptive or more definitive or more foundational to what you're trying to express. But at times you are stuck with this. This is crazy. This makes no sense. The in terms of human rights, what is the benefit to the American policy? The American policy has not worked. If anything, it has strengthened the Iranian government. It's not in any position of falling. The Iranian people are the ones who are subjected to its abuse, as well then to the deprivation caused by the sanctions. I mean, this is doing nothing to strengthen any any American interest, except for possibly somehow this ties into, or it doesn't possibly, this ties into Israeli policy, because you need that type of reflect, you need the other, if you will, to justify your Israeli policy.
Yeah, just going back to what you said, no, the real reason you got to stay in Afghanistan after 20 years and all that doesn't matter is because the Chinese and lithium, that's why.
And they made those arguments, right? And they made that. Then it was, you remember the Russian bounty story, that was a complete lie, a complete fabrication, that the Russians were paying bounties to the Taliban to kill American soldiers, as if after all these years of war in Afghanistan, our occupation, you're now trying to get people to believe that the Taliban are only fighting, occupying American soldiers because the Russians are paying them to. Like that the Taliban have no grievances, no agency, no whatsoever. They have to be being paid by the Russians. They wouldn't be doing this on their own. I mean, it's completely preposterous, but you see that. And I recall even that in 2012, was it 2012? An American helicopter was shot down in Afghanistan with a SEAL team on it. And, 20 some odd guys were killed. Just some dude with an RPG got a lucky shot. I shouldn't say lucky. Was probably a well-prepared helicopter ambush. But the, all these American air crew and SEALs were killed. And what's his name? The Obama spokesperson at the Pentagon. I'm blanking on his name now. The Obama spokesperson at the Pentagon. He put a tweet out saying something along the lines of, who shot down this helicopter? Was it the Taliban? Was it Al-Qaeda? Was it the Iranians? Right? I mean, completely ridiculous, completely ludicrous, no basis in any type of fact or evidence. Doesn't make sense theoretically. Just a stupid, ridiculous thing to say. And this is what the spokesperson at the Pentagon is saying, trying to point the finger at the Iranians for the death of 24 American service members, when it's clear, of course, the Taliban shot it down. But you have that at the highest levels, they're saying this kind of stuff. So you see this hysterical obsession, and even in the midst of the war in Afghanistan, at that point, we were only halfway through it, 10 years in at that point, 10 more years to go. They're trying to make the war about Iran when who we're fighting are the Sunni Afghan Taliban. I mean, I don't understand what so this gets to the point we were talking about. We said where we were having the conversation with Kelly, where it doesn't make sense. There's no way they can really know what they're doing here, other than running to whatever is the most pressing interest of the moment, whether that be political, whether that be financial, whether that be media-based, PR-based, narrative-based. I think a lot of reasons why you have a unwillingness to change policy is because of the politics of it. So what American, and then with that, the PR, the public relations aspects of it, what American administration is going to reverse course on Iran? Politically, that would be domestically, that would be a political act of suicide. As well, then too, you see it just in the general sense of, you never change your policy, because then you have to admit in your narrative that you've changed your policy, and that's the mission. That's an admission of defeat. And so you have this type of just policy that seeks to reinforce the failed policies of the past, because the narrative won't allow you to ever amend or edit or change your policy, because that would be admitting defeat. So you get trapped in this cycle of short-term domestic politics just as much as you do as short-term financial gain, that keeps us in this policy where, anyone who's objective look at this Iran policy and say, this hasn't worked. Why haven't you changed this? It hasn't worked. This very best example is our Cuba policy, right? Who could look at that and say anything other than that, this is a completely failed policy? All you've done is immiserate the Cuban people. You have done nothing else other than that. And but that's what we're in, the cycles we're in, and it's very difficult to break out of those.
Yeah, it seems like if the policy doesn't work, they're like, well, at least we just wrecked their country and they're not successful. They may not be our ally, but at least their life's pretty terrible and they're a nobody on the world stage. But we didn't get what we want, but we'd keep them down. As long as we can keep them down, that's fine. But you made obviously a lot of good points there. And again, you're right about the oversimplification, but it's obviously impossible to kind of do an interview without doing that. But again, there's so many different interests involved, from, the Syrian war, people who hate Assad, Israel, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and then obviously people who just generally thought they could do it for democracy, or they was getting involved with the democratic wants of the people, all this different stuff, whatever you think. And then again, for the Iranian policy, some people could generally be about the hostages, and even though they forget everything that happened before, some people it's about geopolitics. Some just really don't like theocratic Muslim countries, and there's lots of different factors to it. So I think it's important. Again, with Ukraine, you're right, the LNG, I think you actually, when I interviewed you pulled out, it's obviously skyrocketed, and that's a factor, not just the arms, and then people hate Russia. And then obviously, with Azerbaijan, that was 100,000 people left that area. Yeah. But Azerbaijan's been pretty good for Europe with gas since the Russian invasion, right. So don't worry about that. We need that gas. But I appreciate you coming on. It's always good to have you on. You articulate things really well, put it into good framing of everything, and always fair and balanced, which is what I like. You still went on a little bit about obviously the Iranian regime, and again, I think it's important to address some of that as well. That it's not a perfect regime, and I would not want to live there, and many people wouldn't, because a lot of people obviously kind of just ignore that. And I think if you want to get people on the fence, you got to be honest. I think it's the same with the Hamas attack. You see people. Piers Morgan's obviously bad for it, trying to force people to condemn them, which I understand when they're like, nah, I'm not doing that for you. But at the end of the day, I think Dave Smith was on there with it, and he made a good point. It's just, you just look really bad when you don't do that, because if anyone, you can make all these great points about Israel, and then you just lose everyone as soon as you don't condemn that, because yes, there's obviously all the reasons that led up to it, but people just aren't going to get on board with you not condemning the murder of civilians. So I think it's important to that, and most people, like what you said there, you probably very much believe about the Iranian regime, but it's again
if I were Iranian, I'd be marching in the street against the regime as well. And this point about condemning Hamas, I think that's I understand people. There's a thing in the United States where people are drawing parallels to Nat Turner's rebellion. Nat Turner was a slave who rebelled and murdered 50 to 100. I can't remember off the top of my head. Committed, what we would call acts of terrorism. Brutally murdered. I don't know if you can actually murder a slave master, but brutally murdered women and children, right? Particularly say it's this, and making those parallels to what Hamas did. And I think you can condemn the murder of civilians regardless of who does it. Just as you can say, I also believe that the Palestinians have the right to arm resistance. And so any attacks on October 7th by the Palestinians, whether it be Hamas, PIJ, whoever, against Israeli military targets were valid acts of resistance that are protected by international law. You know, you can say that just as you can say killing men, women, children, civilians are war crimes, regardless of who does it, you know?
Yeah, well, yeah, I know you've got to jump off soon, so I'll let you go, as this is about the time you said before the interview. I actually thought, oh no, I won't go as long to give him some more time, but just end up always going on further. But yeah, thanks for coming on. I appreciate it, and we'll have to catch up soon. And best of luck with going to London next Saturday with Danny Davis to do a debate in the House of Lords about Ukraine.
Yeah, thank you very much, Louis. I appreciate it.
By the time this comes out, you'd have done that. So anyone listening, I'll put that in the show. I'll put that in the show notes.
Fantastic. Yeah, great.
What my constant cry was that our biggest problem is our allies. Our allies in the region were our largest problem in Syria. The Turks were great friends, and I have a great relationship with Erdogan, which I've just spent a lot of time with. The Saudis, the Emiratis, etc. What were they doing? They were so determined to take down Assad and essentially have a proxy Sunni-Shia war. What did they do? They poured hundreds of millions of dollars and thousands of tons of weapons into anyone who would fight against Assad, except that the people who were being supplied were al-Nusra and al-Qaeda and the extremist elements of jihadis coming from other parts of the world. Now you think I'm exaggerating? Take a look. Where did all of this go? So now what's happening? All of a sudden, everybody's awakened because this outfit called ISIL, which was al-Qaeda in Iraq, which when they were essentially thrown out of Iraq, found open space and territory in eastern Syria, work with al-Nusra, who we declared a terrorist group early on, and we could not convince our colleagues to stop supplying.